In this tutorial, I'm going to paint a moody forest lake in gouache. Here are all of the materials that I'm using, and we're going to talk more about them as we go through the tutorial. So then here's the reference photo I pulled from Unsplash.com, the royalty-free photography site. And so first things first, I'm going to get out my paints. And it looks like this reference photo calls for mostly blues and greens, and so I'm using an assortment that I have in Winsor Newton Designer's Gouache and Holbein Artist's Gouache. Some like Viridian green, some turquoise green, spring greens. I'm choosing a variety, some bright and like more bluish greens, as well as a few grays. That's ash blue from Holbein, and then white and black to add the contrast. It looks like we're going to start with like a black background and then layer on the trees from there, and then white so that I can show the reflection on the lake and also paint some of the trunks. They look kind of light blue, white like trunks. So those are all the colors that I'm using. I just put them onto my ceramic palette there, and then to separate the lake from the forest, I just put down an extra piece of masking tape so that we can have a clean line and not really have to worry about, putting the paint where it's not supposed to go. So the first things first, I've mentioned it already, I'm going to get the forest part black. And the nice thing about gouache is you can use it like it's acrylic, so it's like a really thick layer, or you can use it more like watercolor. So if you add a little bit of water to it, it creates kind of a fun texture, also makes the paint spread around a little bit longer. So I did kind of a combination there where I added just a little bit of water to that thick-ish layer of black gouache in the background. And after that, you can let it dry yourself. The downside of using gouache as watercolor is it takes longer to dry because of the extra water. But I have a heat tool on hand because I get too impatient. So I often dry my layers using that. Sometimes it doesn't really work as well to dry gouache layers like that, but because I used it mostly like watercolor, it was fine. Okay, so next we're going to paint these trees basically from dark to light. So we started with that dark background, and then we're going to use gouache, which is opaque, to add in the layers mainly from dark to light. So I'm starting with kind of like a deep green, and I mixed that using a turquoise and black, a tiny bit of black with a tiny bit of white, just to create like a greenish gray. And once I started doing that, I thought, I think I better actually do the trunks first. So I mixed the color for the trunks using white and mostly white with just a tiny little bit of blue, so it's not so stark white. And then using a small detail brush, I'm just going to paint thin lines in white all across this black space. I'm just using a round brush, a round number 0 brush, but a liner brush would also work really well here so that you can create those straight lines. You can see some of my lines get a little wobbly, which honestly is fine because it's not like tree trunks are always 100% straight anyway. So if some of your lines are a little wobbly, that's totally fine. One thing I would note as you're painting your lines here with the gouache is if you're trying to get thick, like really starkly white lines, you're likely going to get a dry brush effect, meaning you have some kind of texture in your lines. And that's something that when I first started painting this piece, it kind of bothered me a little bit. And so I tried to add a little bit more paint to my brush stroke, a little bit more water and paint. But the thing about gouache is the more like thick paint you add, the trickier it is to make the lines really thin. And so then I would need to add more water to get the lines really thin, and then but once you add more water, the paint is a little bit more washed out. Then I realized that honestly trunks have texture like that anyway, so I stopped worrying so much about it. But as you can see, I'm just putting these thin lines basically all throughout this black square, the black portion where the trees are going to go. And now that I have the lines, I'm going to start adding in the pine needles from dark to light. So I'm starting with the darker green first. And if you don't have like a dark green that's exactly what your is in the photo or that I'm using, that's okay. My colors aren't exact an exact replica of the colors in the paint in the original reference photo down at the bottom there. But in order to paint the pine needles, I'm just kind of making some lines, some random dots and blobs around the tree trunks. Sometimes I want to see the tree trunk still, so I'm only doing it on either side. And then sometimes I'm putting those blobs across the tree trunk, so parts of the trunk are hidden. And I'm not really having much of a rhyme or reason to like which tree trunks stay hidden and which ones don't. Whenever I paint from reference photos, I use them as a basic guide to help me place things, but I hardly ever do it like, oh, I'm going to place these trees exactly where they're supposed to go, because that seems a little tedious to me. So I just mostly use it like, oh, I think that I can use this technique to create something that looks kind of like that. And then I just kind of move along. I was also describing a few days ago my process for painting trees to my mom, actually, and she was like, how do you know where to place all of the needles? How do you know which direction to go in? And my answer was, I really don't decide. I just kind of let my hand go wherever. And I know that it takes practice to feel comfortable enough to just kind of move your hand and place random blobs. And so it's going to take, if you've never painted trees before, I have a few YouTube tutorials on painting trees, particularly with this kind of blobby style that I'm using here. But I just am kind of wild and free. I don't really notice where the blobs go as long as it's in a general tree shape. So as I've been talking, you'll notice that I'm still just painting these trees with that kind of dark bluish green that still blends. It's dark enough that it still blends in with the black, and that's the whole point, because looking at the reference photo, like, it seems that parts of the clumps of tree are so much in shadow that they look black. And so we're just kind of building off of that, and we're going to work our colors from dark to light and build in that complexity in kind of that order. And so that's what I'm doing right here. Okay, so now that we have that nice layer of dark green, let's start layering in the lighter colors. I have like a spring green that I mixed a little bit with white here. And I'm going to start painting some of the lighter green trees. And notice that the lighter green trees are mostly in the middle. And so that's kind of where I'm going to take my trees. So I have this, when I first started, I felt like my green wasn't quite yellow enough, so I added just a little bit of yellow paint to it. And I am just adding some trees, just the outlines of the trees, sometimes along the trunks and sometimes not, but just adding some outlines of trees in the middle of this forest with that lighter green. Once again, using that kind of blobby technique that I like to use to paint loose pine trees, where I just kind of paint like tufts of paint of pine needles on either side by blobbing out my paintbrush, and without really much rhyme or reason. The more that you practice painting trees like that, the more comfortable you'll be just kind of letting your paintbrush wander. Okay, so here I am taking a little bit darker color with some black, adding it to the green. I added a little too much water there, and so I needed to mop it up with a Q-tip. But I'm taking, now that I have this like the lighter green trees, I'm gonna add some more depth and shape to them by just adding some shadows. So I'm taking a darker green and lightly with my paintbrush, just kind of dusting on that darker green on top of the lighter green trees. And then I'm going to take some lighter green by adding the green and mixing it with white and dusting on some highlights onto the green trees. So by starting with like more of the middling color with that like light green, and then adding on some shadows as well as some highlights. And once again, I'm not really, just because this is like a beginner's loose painting, I'm not really placing the highlights in any particular order or place. I'm just kind of moving around my paintbrush, dusting it in various places to add some of that depth and complexity to the piece that will just, especially, once you back away from the piece, it'll just make it look like the forest is kind of glinting. And so that's kind of my the idea that I had by just adding a little bit of those highlights. And then now that I've added more trees in the middle, I'm going to make some of the trunks slightly more visible, because after looking at the reference photo, it seems to me like especially the middle trunks you can see are pretty clearly white. So that's what I'm doing here. And then for some of the trunks also, I'm adding some, very thin branches that are coming out from the top. So it's almost like a little fork in the road at the top of the tree trunk. And that is just to, again, help add some, variation into this painting. And variation like that will only give the illusion that this is slightly more realistic. So once I've added those extra trunks, I'm just going to continue, adding pine needles to those trunks in the same way that I did the other trunks. And I am just using some blobby techniques to add tufts of needles and leaves to those trees. And I'm going to keep going in the same way that I did the rest of the painting. And so starting with that, like those lighter trees, I'm adding some more lighter green here to help the trees stand out. I think that especially in this painting, the lighter trees are definitely supposed to be like more at the forefront. And so that's why I waited until very last to paint those on top of those additional trunks that I painted. And then once we've added the lighter, similar to how I did it earlier, I'm just taking some dark paint and, adding some shadow on top of those light trees to make them have even more depth to them. And then one last thing with the tree trunks, it seems to be there's one kind of fallen tree trunk toward the bottom, and so that's what I'm painting in right there. And then I'm going to take some of that lighter, it's like white paint mixed with blue paint, and draw in some rocks that are along the riverbank. It's hard to tell with the reference photo so small, but there are some rocks along this riverbank. And so I'm using the lighter gouache to paint the rocks. And right now it looks like they're on top of black. And so then I'm going to layer on even more colors to make the bottom look more like ground than it does just like the rocks are floating in midair. So I painted the rocks, and I am layering on varying darknesses, like varying values of green, varying shades of green, making sure to keep some of the black spaces, keep some of the darker green spaces, and just adding a few little like lighter highlights here and there to add some texture to this ground, to the riverbank that I'm trying to paint here. And then I'm going to take some darker green and just add shadows along the bottoms of the stones, as well as using a dry brush to add a little bit of texture on top of the stones to make them look more like stones. So that's how I created the riverbank. And Now we're going to take a look at painting the lake. So I'll take off my tape, and for the lake I'm mostly using blues. My lake is going to be a little more blue than the actual photo. The photo looks like it's a little bit more green, but so just for reference, my lake is a little bit more blue. And so I'm painting from the bottom, and I'm using gouache in both the like watercolor way, and I'm using the dry brush technique. So I'm making sure that by the time I get to the top, where the water is going to meet the forest, my brush is a little bit more dry, and so it leaves behind streaks of that white space. And those streaks are meant to mimic the twinkling, I guess, like the reflecting of light on top of the water. And that way I don't have to use as much white paint to paint in those like sparkles manually. I can just use a dry brush to use the white of the paper to make those sparkles. And then I use darker paint along the bottom to create a kind of gradient. So it's lots of different colors of green and blue and like almost black toward the bottom, and then up toward the top, I'm starting to use the dry brush technique to add in lighter blues, and then using also the lighter blue, I'm adding in some little reflections of the tree trunk. The thing with those reflections is we want them to be kind of blurry, and with gouache, the way that I'm achieving that is also by using kind of like a dry brush. And so while the lake is still wet, kind of wet, in the way that gouache is still wet, like it's still kind of creamy, I'm using a dry brush to paint on some lighter lines along the bottom to kind of make those blurry reflections on there. And then as I'm continuing to paint this lake, it's mostly just, adding in strokes here and there of different colors. Lighter towards the top, where it's clearly like in the reference photo, that's where you get the sparkling of the reflection. So I'm going to add a little bit even more white using the dry brush technique here. And the dry brush technique is just going to help me to enhance that kind of sparkling look. And then using vertical lines, I'm adding in different kinds of colors. So the trick with water, to make it reflecting, to make it look like water, is to paint different colors in vertical lines like that. And also remember that it doesn't have to be perfect. It doesn't have to look exactly like the reference photo. Mine certainly doesn't, but I'm just kind of going back and forth between painting vertical lines, and I keep saying vertical, I mean horizontal, between painting horizontal lines and vertical lines to kind of create that rippling effect. You saw my camera shaking because while I'm doing this, I'm holding my son, and he keeps reaching for the camera, so my apologies for the shaky camera during the end of this YouTube video. But yeah, so that about sums it up. I took off my tape, and that is my tutorial. So I hope you liked it. I hope that it was helpful for you as you are learning gouache and learning to paint from a reference photo. I think that painting lakes and painting water can be tricky, but the more you practice it, the more you'll be better at it. And so I just kind of want to go back to that, mentioning it's a lot about going back and forth between painting those horizontal ripples and then making sure you get those subtle, blurry, vertical reflection of the trees to capture that mirror effect. So anyway, thank you so much for watching this video. If you had fun, I would love to hear about it, and if you paint along with me, I would love to see your progress in the work that you do. So make sure to tag me on Instagram if you post your stuff there, and make sure to hit that subscribe button. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.